Hello and welcome to the channel Echoes Shadows. Working in a hotel can be a smooth experience, but it's not always that way. Get ready to hear 4 real and terrifying stories where hotel employees face the unexplainable. If you think you've seen it all, stay until the end of the video. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the upcoming stories. Thank you very much. Story 1. Visits from Beyond.
My name is Andrew, and I live in Jacksonville, Florida. I've been working as a valet for about 5 years now. Most of the time, the job is pretty laid back. I always enjoyed driving different cars, some I'd never get to drive otherwise. But after that night, I don't think I'll ever look at my job the same way again. It was a regular Tuesday night in December. The hotel wasn't too busy, probably because it was low season. I lived in a modest neighborhood, Riverside, with my mom and younger sister. I'm a bit of a homebody, mostly into video games and hanging out with friends on weekends. The routine at work had stopped surprising me a long time ago. We had all kinds of guests, wealthy people, business travelers, big families, and couples on their honeymoons. Nothing out of the ordinary. But that night, everything changed. I arrived for my night shift around 6 p.m. The first thing I always do is check the list of arrivals and departures to get a sense of how the night will go. That night, it was quiet, barely any guests, so I thought it would be an easy shift. Little did I know what was about to happen. Around 10 p.m., I was in the parking lot, waiting for someone to request their car or a call from the front desk. The wind was blowing hard and the parking lot was surrounded by some old trees that made a creepy sound. I've never been one to get spooked easily, but that night, there was something off. I felt as if I was being watched. The receptionist, Jenna, called me on the radio. "Andrew, a guest in room 508 needs their car." I grabbed the keys and headed over to the parking area. As soon as I got into the car, something strange happened. The rear view mirror started moving on its own. Just a malfunction, I thought, trying to calm myself. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I'd driven plenty of cars before, and had never seen that. When I arrived at the front of the hotel, the guest hadn't come down yet. I stepped out of the car and waited by the door. Suddenly, I felt a chill run down my spine, something I had never felt before. The air felt thick, as if I were being observed. I glanced around, but there was no one in sight. Then, the truly strange thing happened. The door of the car I was waiting by, which I had left open, slammed shut as if someone had closed it in anger. The sound echoed through the empty parking lot. I took a step back, my heart racing. I looked again at the car, and that's when I saw her. In the back seat, there was someone sitting. I froze. My first instinct was to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I was paralyzed, just staring at the figure in the back seat. It was a woman, her head bowed, hair covering her face. Her clothes looked old-fashioned, like something out of another time. I couldn't see her face, but I felt like she knew I was there. "Can I help you?" My voice came out shaky, almost a whisper, but there was no answer. Suddenly, she lifted her head, and I saw it. Her face. It wasn't normal. Her eyes were sunken as if she hadn't slept in days. Her skin was pale, almost translucent. When she opened her mouth, it looked like she wanted to say something, but no sound came out. Despair washed over me. I had never felt so terrified in my life. Without thinking, I bolted toward the hotel. The first person I saw was Jenna at the front desk. "There's a woman in the car!" I shouted, breathless. She looked at me confused. "What woman, Andrew?" "There's no one out there." I tried to explain, but her expression said it all. She didn't believe me. She insisted it was impossible for anyone to enter the car without her seeing, as the reception had a direct view of the entrance. I took her to the car, still trembling. When we arrived, the vehicle was empty. No woman, nothing amiss, as if I had imagined the whole thing. But I knew I hadn't. The scent of her perfume still lingered in the air, something old and unfamiliar. "Are you okay, Andrew?" Jenna asked, genuinely worried now. I could only shake my head, unable to find the words. She went back inside, and I remained there staring at the car. I couldn't understand what had just happened. It was nearly midnight when I decided I needed a break. I went to the staff lounge and sat down, trying to calm my nerves. but the silence there only made me feel more anxious. That's when I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, echoing steps down the corridor leading to the parking lot. "Jenna?" I called, but there was no response. I stood up slowly, and the footsteps stopped. I walked to the lounge door and peered into the corridor. Nothing. Everything seemed normal. I took a deep breath and returned to my seat. Then the lights flickered. My heart raced again, and this time I knew I wasn't alone. A cold breeze swept through the room, and before I could react, something touched my shoulder. It wasn't a normal touch. It felt icy, almost freezing. I turned around abruptly, but there was no one there. Silence enveloped everything, and I could sense that the worst was yet to come. Suddenly, the radio I had left on the table turned on by itself. A crackling sound filled the room, followed by a low voice, barely audible. "You saw me!" The phrase echoed in my mind, and I felt my sanity slipping away. I dashed out of there, straight to the parking lot. I needed to get out of that place. As I passed the reception, Jenna looked at me with confusion. "What is it now?" she asked, but I couldn't respond. I simply left, not daring to look back. The next day, I requested a transfer to the morning shift. Since then, I've never worked nights again. I don't know who that woman was or what she wanted, but I'll never forget what I saw. Even today, whenever I pass by that parking lot, I feel a shiver, as if she's still there, watching, waiting for the right moment to appear again.
Story 2. The Night That Never Ended.
My name is Peter. I'm 32 years old, and I work as a receptionist at a small hotel in Salem, Massachusetts. I've always loved the quietness of the city, with its historical streets, the cool air, and the stories surrounding the place. I've lived here my whole life and have been at this job for over 7 years. I enjoy the routine, meeting tourists from all over, and getting to hear new stories. Working nights wasn't a problem either, at least until that night. It was a regular Wednesday, or at least it seemed to be. I was working the night shift, like always, with Becca, the housekeeper. Sometimes she helped me out at the front desk. The hotel was practically empty, off-season, with only a few guests in the rooms. It was a quiet night, the kind you expect when you're just counting the hours until your shift ends. Or so I thought. Around 10 p.m., the phone at the front desk rang. It was a dull, muffled ring, different from the usual sound. The screen showed the call coming from room 212. That was odd because I knew that room was vacant. I answered, feeling a bit uneasy. "Good evening. Reception. Peter speaking." There was nothing on the other end, just the sound of heavy breathing, slow and strained, like someone was trying to speak but couldn't. After a few seconds, the line went dead. Becca, standing next to me, frowned, clearly uncomfortable. "That room's empty, right?" she asked. I nodded, trying to shake off the creeping feeling in my chest. I checked the system and confirmed what I already knew. Room 212 had been out of use for maintenance for weeks. I figured it must have been a glitch with the phone system, or maybe someone messing around. After that, the front desk fell into an odd, heavy silence. No guests coming down for extra towels, no movement at all. Becca started talking about the weather, trying to break the tension, but it was obvious the atmosphere had changed. It felt off. About an hour later, I had calmed down, convincing myself it was nothing. But then I heard footsteps in the hallway, right near room 212. They were slow, dragging, almost like someone was shuffling along. The carpet muffled the sound a bit, but it was clear enough to put me on edge. "Becca, did you hear that?" I asked, keeping my voice low. She nodded, and the look on her face showed she was just as nervous as I was. Without thinking, I grabbed the master key and decided to check it out. I walked down the hallway, with Becca following close behind. The lights were dim, and the further we went, the more distant the footsteps sounded, like they were leading us away. The hallway was empty. I reached the door to room 212. For some reason, I hesitated before putting the key in the lock. A chill ran down my spine, and everything inside me screamed that I shouldn't open that door. Becca was right behind me, looking just as uneasy. I forced myself to turn the key, and the door creaked open. The room was pitch black, except for a faint beam of moonlight coming through the window. But it wasn't the darkness that scared me. The air in the room was thick, colder than the rest of the hotel, And the smell, it was strange. It smelled like damp earth and mildew. I'd never smelled anything like it before. I stepped into the room, my heart racing, while Becca stayed at the door, looking visibly uneasy. I made my way to the bathroom, and as soon as I stepped in, I felt it. A presence, like someone was standing there with me. My heart pounded harder, and suddenly the mirror fogged up, as if someone had just taken a hot shower. But that couldn't be. The room had been vacant for days. And then I saw it. Words started forming on the glass, slowly at first, like someone was writing from the other side. "Get out!" I froze, my blood running cold, and for a few seconds I couldn't move. I wanted to convince myself it was just condensation, but the fear was real, deep in my gut. "Peter." Becca's voice was shaky, barely above a whisper, snapping me back to reality. When I looked at her standing in the doorway, the expression on her face told me she had seen it too. I rushed out of the bathroom, pulling Becca with me, and slammed the door behind us. We stood in the hallway, breathing heavily, trying to make sense of what just happened. I looked at her, searching for an explanation, but she was just as scared as I was. "We should call security," she said, her voice trembling. I didn't argue. We made our way back to the front desk, and I grabbed the radio to call Carl, the night security guard. When he arrived, we tried to explain what happened, but he didn't seem to believe us. "You two must be tired seeing things that aren't there," he said. But even with his skepticism, he agreed to check the room. Carl was a tough guy, not one to get spooked easily. But when we went back to room 212, something changed in his expression. We stepped inside, and what we saw made my stomach drop. All the curtains were closed, something I knew for a fact wasn't like that when we left. And on the floor near the bed were deep scratches, like someone had clawed at the wooden boards with their nails. Becca and I exchanged a look, and in that moment, we knew we weren't alone in that room. Carl, clearly unsettled, told us to lock the room and leave it for the morning. And that's exactly what we did. When my shift finally ended, I went home, but I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. The silence in my apartment, usually comforting, now felt oppressive. To this day, every time I walk past that hallway in the hotel, that same chill comes back. And believe it or not, after that night, no one ever stayed in room 212 again. Some stories, they say, are better left untold. Maybe this is one of them.
Story 3. The presence in the kitchen.
I work as a cook at a pretty well-known hotel here in Aspen, Colorado. My name is John, and I've been in this business for about 5 years. You know, I've always loved cooking, ever since I was a kid, but I never thought I'd experience something as strange as what happened that night. Back then, I lived in a small, 2-bedroom apartment in the heart of the city. It was simple but comfortable, about a 20-minute walk from work. Besides cooking, I like to spend my time watching shows and playing video games. Nothing too out of the ordinary. It all happened on a winter night during one of those holiday weekends when the town is packed with tourists. The hotel was fully booked, and there was a lot of work to do. Like usual, I was the last one to leave the kitchen. It was around midnight when the last room service order was sent up, and I decided to close everything down and head home. I was exhausted, and all I wanted was to crash into bed. The kitchen was in the basement of the hotel, far from the noise and bustle of the guests. It was always quiet down there, just the hum of the freezers and refrigerators breaking the silence. I was used to it, but that night, something felt different. The air was colder than usual, and there was this weird, heavy silence. It's hard to explain, but it felt like I wasn't alone. I had just closed the walk-in freezer and was getting ready to turn off the kitchen lights when I heard a sound. Pots clanging. I thought maybe it was a coworker coming back to grab something they'd forgotten, but when I turned around, no one was there. I walked over to the counters, and to my surprise, all the pots were in their place. I checked the cupboards, looked under the sink. Nothing. There was no explanation for the noise. But you know when you try to brush it off? That instinct to tell yourself it's just in your head? That's exactly what I did, and I kept going. But then, the atmosphere got weird. I felt this icy wind brush across my face, even though I knew all the doors and windows were shut. It was like something had moved past me. I got goosebumps from head to toe, and at that moment, the silence in the kitchen felt even more oppressive. Something was wrong. I headed toward the door to leave, but suddenly the air became heavy, suffocating. That's when I heard footsteps behind me. But they weren't normal footsteps. They were slow, dragging, like someone struggling to walk. I glanced at the pots, and in their reflection, I saw a tall shadow standing there in the middle of the kitchen. I froze. My body locked up, and I felt my heart racing. The first thought that hit me was to run, but my legs wouldn't move. It was like something was holding me there. I slowly turned around, trying to gather the courage. Nothing. Just the empty kitchen, dimly lit by the flickering overhead light. But I knew I wasn't alone. I could feel it, this presence, like someone was watching me. That's when I saw her. In the corner near the sink, there was a figure. It looked like a woman, or at least it seemed like it. She was wearing a long black dress, drenched in water as if she had just walked out of a river. Her face, that was the most terrifying part. She had no eyes, just two dark, empty holes where her eyes should have been. Her hair was wild, falling over her face, and her skin was pale, almost transparent, and she was staring right at me. I couldn't move. Fear had paralyzed me in a way I had never felt before. She started to move toward me slowly, dragging her feet across the floor. With each step she took, the air felt heavier, harder to breathe. My eyes were locked on her, and my body wouldn't respond. Then she stopped, right in front of me, just inches away. I could smell the dampness and decay coming from her. Suddenly, I felt something cold touch my shoulder. It was a freezing, heavy grip, like ice pressing down on me. My heart felt like it was going to explode out of my chest. I tried to scream, but nothing came out. I was completely at the mercy of whatever this was. Then, without warning, she vanished, just disappeared into thin air, like she was never there. I took a deep breath, and in that split second, everything seemed to go back to normal. The air was clear again, the coldness faded, and the kitchen looked exactly the same as before. But I knew it wasn't my imagination. The touch on my shoulder, the presence, it was real. I grabbed my things, shut off the lights, and got out of there as fast as I could. That night, when I got home, I sat on my bed for hours trying to make sense of what had happened. I couldn't sleep, and the image of that figure kept haunting my thoughts. The next day, I mentioned it to a coworker, but he just laughed and said I'd been working too much, that it was all in my head. But I know what I saw. And to this day, whenever I'm alone in that kitchen at night, I can still feel her there, watching, waiting for the right moment to come back again.
Story 4. The Mystery of Room 304.
My name is John. I'm 34 years old and I work as a front desk receptionist at a hotel in Miami, Florida. I've always liked this city. Ever since I was a kid, my family would come here on vacation. So when I got this job, it felt like fate. Life here is peaceful, even though the hotel is in the center of town, in a slightly busier area. When I'm not working, I enjoy running through the trails, riding my bike, or just having coffee at a local cafe. But one night changed my life completely. It was a Wednesday in August, I remember clearly, because it was colder than usual, even for Salem. I was working the night shift, something I wasn't too fond of, but the pay was good, and the tips from guests sometimes made up for the exhaustion. The hotel wasn't very full, only 2 or 3 rooms were occupied, and the silence at the front desk was heavy, almost suffocating. It was around 11:30 p.m. when the reception phone rang. On the other end of the line, a woman's voice. It sounded faint, almost as if she was struggling to speak. "Good evening. Can you come to room 304? I found the request odd. I knew room 304 was unoccupied. The last guest had checked out 2 days ago, and the room had been locked ever since. No one else had checked in there. A chill ran down my spine, but I thought maybe it was a system error. "Are you sure it's room 304? I asked, trying to keep my voice professional, but the truth was I was already nervous. "Yes, please, come quickly." The line cut off abruptly, and the sound of the continuous dial tone made me even more uncomfortable. I knew something wasn't right, but it was part of my job to check these things, so I grabbed the master key, one that opens any door in the hotel, and headed down the halls. Each step echoed off the walls like a whisper, unnerving. The hallway lights flickered slightly, as if there was an issue with the electricity. When I reached the third floor, the sense of unease grew stronger. The air was colder, thicker, and as I passed by the other rooms, I felt like something was watching me from behind each door. I tried to shake off the feeling, but it was impossible. I was there, alone, in a nearly empty hotel corridor, heading toward a room that shouldn't have been occupied. Finally, I arrived at 304. I stood in front of the door for a few seconds, hesitating. Something inside me screamed to turn back, but I had to make sure this wasn't some kind of prank, or worse, that a guest wasn't really in need of help. I slid the key into the lock, took a deep breath, and turned the handle. The door opened with a slow, muffled creak. The room was dark except for the faint moonlight seeping through the half-closed curtains. The air was freezing, much colder than the rest of the hotel, and there was a sense of abandonment that immediately struck me. I couldn't understand how this was possible. That room, which should have been empty, smelled damp, like it hadn't been entered in decades. And then I saw her. Sitting at the edge of the bed, a woman. Her face was partially hidden by her hair, which seemed wet and stuck to her skin. She wore a white dress, stained with something that I didn't want to believe was what I thought it was. The longer I looked, the more certain I was that something was terribly wrong. This woman didn't move, didn't speak. She just sat there motionless, as if she had been waiting for me. My heart started to pound harder. I tried to swallow, but my mouth was dry. Every part of me was screaming to leave, but my feet felt glued to the floor. I tried to speak, but no words came out. All I could do was take a step back, and at that exact moment, she lifted her head. Her eyes? I'll never forget those eyes. They were sunken, almost like two black holes, lifeless. An empty gaze, but at the same time filled with something dark, ancient. She smiled slightly, a smile that made me feel like the blood drained from my body. And before I could react, she began to stand up. That's when everything happened at once. The lights in the room began to flicker violently, the door slammed shut with a loud bang, and I felt a cold wind rush past me. The woman was now standing, just a few feet away, her eyes still locked on mine. I tried to move, run, scream, but it was as if something was holding me there. My body was paralyzed with fear, and the only sound I could hear was my own breathing, getting heavier by the second. Then she spoke. "You shouldn't have come." Her voice was a cold whisper, almost an echo that bounced off the walls, and in the next moment, I felt pressure on my chest. Something invisible pushed me with such force that I was thrown against the wall. The impact was so hard that I felt my head slam, and my vision went blurry for a few seconds. When I regained focus, the woman was gone. The room was empty, and the silence was deafening, except for the irregular buzzing of the flickering lights. I struggled to get up, my body aching all over, but I needed to get out of there. I ran through the corridors without looking back, not knowing if she was following me or if it was all over. I didn't stop until I reached the front desk. I sat behind the counter, panting, heart racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I turned on the security cameras, hoping to see something that would prove what I'd witnessed, but nothing. The footage showed the hallway was normal, and room 304, according to the cameras, had never been opened that night. I spent the rest of the shift staring at the front door, waiting for her to appear again, but nothing else happened. When my coworker arrived in the morning, I was already ready to leave. I didn't tell anyone. Who would believe me? I decided to keep it to myself, but even now, months later, I still feel like I'm not alone when I walk through the hotel corridors. And to this day, I've never answered another call from room 304.